These notes are a summary of Lesson 1, Chapter 1 in your book about North America before Columbus, kind of going over some of the Native American tribes that lived here. The very first humans to arrive in America arrived somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 years ago. Scientists have looked at it and they've thought, just through DNA testing and different things like that, that they came most probably from Northeast Asia. And the way that they think they got here was during the last ice age. There was a whole lot of ice and things like that, or a lot of a lot of the world's water had turned to ice. And so up here in this corner of the map, where Russia comes really close to the United States here, really close to Alaska, what's today Alaska, there was quite a bit more ice, and so a lot of the people and animals and things like that could walk across this land bridge. And this land bridge that developed here because of the ice was known as Beringia. Beringia. Okay, and what happened is some of the prey of the natives, right? So basically, the animals that they were hunting started to come across that land bridge, and they followed those herds. The people followed those herds and ended up in a new continent that had previously never had people before. And over time, they spread down all through the Americas, and that includes all the way down into South America as well. All right, so they spread all across those, but pretty much the scientists think all of them came from that Northeast Asia area, that corner of Russia, that kind of area. So that's what happened. And at that time, a lot of them were hunters and gatherers and really trying to follow the animals and survive in that way. And then an agricultural revolution happened. An agricultural revolution is when people learn how to plant and raise crops. So was very popular. It was called maize in early America. Beans were very popular, and what happened because of the agricultural revolution is people are allowed to stop moving because they have food. They don't have to chase and follow their food anymore. So they're allowed to stop moving, and the societies can stay in one place and become more developed and grow larger because a smaller society is much easier to move around from place to place, whereas a larger society is harder to do that. So it needs to be in place. A lot of times when people think about the Native Americans, they think about just one type of people, but that's just not true. There's so many different types of people. If we look at this map here, you can see each one of those little words is a different tribe, and we've even, broken them down into cultural regions where the cultures were similar, but in any one of those cultural regions, you'll see 20, 30, 40, 50 different tribes. So there's different languages, different cultures. They lived in different ways. Some of them were those nomadic herders that we talked about before that moved from place to place following the animals that they would kill and then eat and use for a lot of tools and clothes and things like that. So some of them were that, and some of them built these huge complex cities in other areas as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to examine some of the specific societies that came through in North and South America. Take a minute to answer this question in your notes. We're going to start out with the oldest society that we know of. This is the Olmec Society. The Olmec Society started off in 1500 BC near Veracruz, Mexico. So right here. And what we really need to know about them is that they developed a very sophisticated society. We know that they had these huge temples and pyramids to honor their gods and do different things like that. So we know they had developed religion. We know, or we think at least, that they had leaders that they looked up to because they have these stone heads that are up to like 8 or 9 foot tall. They're like 20 tons. They're huge stone heads. that we assume were statues and homage to their leaders. Okay, they also developed a type of writing so that they could keep records and things like that. And you can see an example of Olmec hieroglyphic writing. And hieroglyphic just means that they write with pictures as symbols instead of letters as symbols. Okay, and then they also had many scientific advances that they came through or came upon, including these really large cities that they built up and, a trade network and all of that kind of stuff that lasted for quite a while until AD 650. The Maya people, who started in 200 AD, also started out here in Mexico, but on the Yucatan Peninsula. And in this peninsula, they started to spread through, especially down into Central America. They were amazing at a couple of different things. They were amazing at engineering and math. And the engineering that they did, I mean, this is a picture from Chichen Itza. They made these huge pyramids up to 200 feet tall, just enormous pyramids. And then on the top of them, they had these little temples. And in those temples, they would perform their rituals. And it was amazing how well they knew the stars and the positioning of all that kind of stuff. And that came in with their math as well. And the amount that they studied the stars, it allowed them to use their mathematical skills and the position of the stars to develop this extremely accurate calendar that was accurate, I mean, up until 2012. So, and this was from 200 AD. This was a huge, amazing thing to do as a society way back then. Um, and so this is a picture. I'm going to try to erase here. Okay, this picture kind of shows you the some of their positioning, because what happens is there's this big festival every year, twice a year during the equinox when the sun is directly over the equator. And what they figured out is that when they did that, the shadow cast by these steps and everything would make this staircase look like the body of a snake. So you can kind of see going down is this light body of a snake, and then down here at the bottom they have a snake's head, because that was an important religious figure for them. But it's just kind of cool to think, wow, they knew exactly how to place their buildings without computers, without a lot of this different things that we can figure it out with today. Their government was set up into city states. City states are an interesting thing. Each little city is like its own country. So they're all Mayan people, but they get to control themselves city by city by city by city. So being in control of their own territory, that's great and all, but sometimes the territories would have little feuds and they would go to war with each other. And so that kind of made it an unstable government that was, that there led to some difficulties, right? In 900s AD, the civilization of Maya declined because we're not sure, but it's probably one of these two reasons. Either the farmers exhausted the soil, so they used up all the soil. They did too much farming in one area, and the soil lost all its nutrients, and didn't have food, so people were hungry and rioting. Or invaders came in from the north and just completely destroyed the region. We're not 100% sure which one of those happened. The next society we're going to talk about is the Aztec Society. They started out as the Toltec, so we're calling them the Toltec and the Aztec Society, starting in 1150 AD in Mexico City, as you can see right there. Okay, and so they built up this city by the name of Tula. They called it Tula. And they had these huge pyramids and palaces. And what's kind of interesting about the Aztec is they got a lot of attention from the Spanish people when they came, because they were the first people to use copper and gold in jewelry. And we all know that when those conquistadors came over, they wanted that gold. So they were taken over by a different group of people called the Chichimec. And these Chichimec people, they had a small group of them which took over the area. And those people founded this city named Tenochtitlan. And Tenochtitlan would become the capital of the Aztec Empire. It's in Mexico City, and it was built on a lake. So they'd have these, these small, narrow ways of getting out to the city, and those were the only ways. So it was really easy to defend it from an attack. And so they were able to build this city up very, very large on essentially an island in a lake. So it had a giant built-in moat. All right. And so these Aztec ruled mostly through military power, and they got quite powerful through this. They would go in and attack people and take some of their people and sacrifice them as part of some rituals. And then once they had control over your country, they would demand something called tribute. And tribute is basically saying, we beat you, now you pay us money all the time. Okay. And what it's seen as is basically you're paying us for your protection, right? And so we will protect you if you give us a certain amount of money. But the problem is, they're really only their threat was me. So that's like me saying, I will protect you from punches if you give me money. But I'm the one that's going to punch you if you don't give me money. So it's kind of a shady deal there, but that's essentially what tribute is. And by the 1500s, Aztecs had 5 million people under control. This was not a small society. It grew very large, very fast. Take a minute to write out the answer to this question. The Western cultures that we're going to talk about are mostly from the desert southwest of the United States. So the Hohokam is where we'll start, and they came up in 8700 in south central Arizona. The way that their civilization was able to grow, again, you have to have that farming to be able to grow. They developed irrigation canals. So they built these canals, these man-made small rivers that would come from the river all the way out to their farm fields to help be able to supply water to many, many farms so that crops could grow in this desert area. So that's a great example of human environment interaction that you've talked about previously in your geography classes. And so society started to grow, and as a society grows and settles down, now you have more time that you're not worrying about surviving, and so they really started to develop their arts. They had these amazing pottery, these clay pottery, painted clay pottery pieces that we found pieces of. They had amazing turquoise pendants. They would take cactus juice and etch different pictures into shells, so it was a really heavy art scene there. However, it did start to decline and went away in the 1500s. The Anasazi started to end up about the same time in Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, kind of the spot. It's called the Four Corners, where those four countries meet, four states meet. And their name means the ancient ones, and it was given later by later natives who called them the ancient ones. But what they did is to survive, they needed that water too. Water was a problem for them also. But what they did is they were able to build a bunch of basins and canals and stuff that fed all of the rainwater into these depressions. So think of like a bowl in the earth that they lined with stone, and so then the water would be there for them to use whenever they wanted. So they'd store all the rainwater in those areas. And then they built these cities that were really amazing. And the Spanish would come to call them pueblos, which basically means city. But they were these multi-story buildings. You can see a picture of one here. These multi-story buildings of adobe, which is like a brick made out of mud, basically. And cut stone. And one of the biggest ones was Pueblo Bonito, which means, beautiful city. And it had 600 rooms and 1,000 people were living in it. So it was a fairly large city out in the desert. In the Mississippi in cultures, which is what they were called, right, kind of around the Mississippi, but in that southeast area, the they were really amazing builders of cities, and they built this huge city in the southeast called Cahokia. And here's a picture of what Cahokia might have looked like. We can see the houses and the way they were built, and then we can see this big pyramid, which is a pretty amazing thing made out of dirt, right? It's made out of earth, and so they would build these earth pyramids, which we see as after weathering and erosion has kind of rounded them off, we see as Native American mounds. Okay, and so in a lot of different areas where this culture was prevalent, you can see these huge mounds that were built up in the earth. Now, in the southeast, eventually Cahokia did decline. We're not 100% sure, but again, this is either or situation. But either it was from attacks from other native tribes, or the population just grew too large and they weren't able to sustain it. People started to leave, things like that. So Cahokia started to decline, but their culture survived in a lot of Native American tribes that kept going on. So things like towns were built with a central plaza for people to meet and socialize and all that kind of stuff. And the tradition of the women doing the farming and the men going out and doing the hunting survived for a very long time in the Native cultures. The largest group that kind of came out of this area was the Cherokee. That's the one you've probably have heard of the most. And so that's the type of natives we're talking about at this point. The Great Plains natives, people like the Lakota Sioux and different tribes like that, they were nomads. So their main thing is they would pack up their entire city and they would follow the buffalo herds. So wherever they would go, if they would migrate to the south for winter, to the north for summer, the Native Americans would follow them. Now, life changed a lot for these natives when the horses were brought to America. Horses are not native to America. They did not start here with horses. They were from Europe, okay? And we had none of them here in America. The natives had none of them here in America. But then when the Spanish came over, some of their horses got loose and they quickly thrived and populated the area. And the Great Plains natives, captured some of them, domesticated them, and really mastered the horse, becoming some of the best horseback fighters and hunters in the entire world, even though when their culture started, there were no horses. And the last group we're going to talk about is the Northeastern tribes. The Northeastern tribes, they mostly used hunting, fishing, farming to survive. So hunting and fishing were really big, but they also supplemented it with farming. They did something called slash and burn farming. So they would take these big forested areas and they would cut them down and burn them. And then the soil would be really rich for farming after that with the ash and everything like that. And so they would farm it until it became used up, and then they would go on and continue to slash and burn another area of forest. The Algonquin people are one group. They were found in New England and Virginia. These are the natives that were the first ones to encounter the English settlers. So like the Powhatan people are one of the examples. But essentially the way that the Northeastern culture was set up is they had very similar cultures, but the Algonquin, that we call them Algonquin people, they spoke the Algonquin languages. The Iroquois people spoke Iroquois languages. So that's our second group, is the Iroquois right down here. Okay, and they were found from New York, the western edge of New York, all the way up into Canada. All right, and so what they did, the way that they lived, is they had their extended families all lived in a big long house. So we see these pictures of these long houses. So you can think of it almost like a barracks or something like that. But they would live all together in these long houses. And then all of the families would get together and put up stockades around to protect themselves. So stockade is kind of like a fence, but it's these big posts that you drive into the ground. So all of these posts are driven into the ground to be very strong. So it's difficult to get in there, which means it's easy to defend from animals and other people. And so what happened in these towns, again, the women's role, they did most of the farming while the men were out hunting. They put together most of the kinship groups, so the friend groups, the social things that were done. And then the women were in charge of selecting the rulers, the people who were in charge of the place. Okay, so they were the voters as well. So they kind of ran the city. They stayed home and ran the city while the men were out hunting. the Iroquois were always fighting with each other. A lot of the nations of Iroquois were fighting with each other. So five of them got together: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk got together, and there was this tribal elder named Decanawida, and he was a chief of the Mohawk, and he came together and they created this great binding law, it's called. And what that did is it allowed these Iroquois people to have an alliance that would help them to defend against any outside forces or other tribes or anything like that. So this is an interesting look at one of the early alliances in American history. Please write 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, if you get it all, then please go ahead and create 3 test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test from this particular lesson.